Welcome to the third lecture in the Public Health Through Time series. This lecture will examine why there was a decline in public health during the industrial age. This lecture will be split into 4 parts. In the first section, we will examine why rapid urbanization led to a sharp decline in public health at the start of the industrial age. We will then study the work of Edwin Chadwick investigating the epidemic of cholera in the 1840s. Then we will study John Snow's breakthrough investigation into the Broad Street pump and how this significantly advanced people's understanding of cholera. Finally, we will study the measures put in place by the government, namely the Public Health Acts of 1848 and 1875, alongside a huge building works to create the London sewer system. From 1750, England was undergoing an industrial revolution. This meant that most industrial production now took place in factories rather than in the countryside. Towns grew up around the factories and workers flocked to these towns in search of jobs. Many factories had worker cottages and terrace housing close by. This placed significant strain on the public health facilities. Firstly, there were very few limits on the type of houses that landlords could build. There were no laws or regulations to say that landlords could not build back-to-back houses with very little outdoor space. As a result, most houses were multi-story and contained more than one family, including a family in a cellar dwelling. There was limited ventilation or access to fresh air, and so it was easy for disease to spread. The lack of ventilation also meant that the air was stagnant and stunk, which meant the theory of miasma became even more popular. Furthermore, there was inadequate sanitation for the workers in these overcrowded houses. Families had to share a privy, which would feed into a cesspit, essentially a large underground heap of human waste, which would easily overfill. There was usually a single water pump for each street, and this was the only access that families had to water, other than the polluted rivers. The water was supposed to be clean, but there wasn't a proper water and sewage system, and so cross-contamination was common. Factories also polluted the air with chemicals released from their large chimneys. This created smog, the mixture of fog and smoke, that seemed to further reinforce the idea of miasma. The factory smoke would often cause respiratory problems for the workers, such as asthma and pneumonia. The factory waste was also discharged into the river, further polluting the city's water supply. As a result of these new appalling conditions, a new deadly disease arrived called cholera. The first epidemic took place in London in the 1830s, but it soon blighted all major industrial cities across London. The symptoms of cholera were especially unpleasant since it caused violent sickness and diarrhea. It is for this reason that it spread so easily in the poorest and most overcrowded areas of a city. It also caused those areas to have an appalling stench of human waste, further reinforcing the theory of miasma. Let's now examine social reformers who investigated the cholera epidemic. A social reformer was a rich and well-educated person who used their position of privilege to help the poor. We will be learning about several social reformers over the next 3 lectures. Edwin Chadwick was the first social reformer to investigate the problem. He was instructed by Parliament to conduct an investigation into the poorest regions of London and write a report about the living conditions. He published his report in 1842, and it concluded that poverty and overcrowded living conditions had an adverse effect on people's health. As part of the report, Chadwick made a number of suggestions to improve the lives of the poor. He advised that local authorities should establish a waste disposal system to clear the streets of rubbish, and that there should be a board of health in every district. He also suggested that the government invest in providing a proper sewage system and provision for clean water for every household. Chadwick tried to incentivize factory owners by showing them the link between poor health and poor work productivity. He essentially argued that if a factory owner was to take care of their workers and provide them with safe accommodation, then they would work harder and for longer hours. He said in the long run this should generate more profit for the business. You can link the work of Edwin Chadwick to the factor of communication. This is because Chadwick distributed 10,000 copies of his report to citizens of London, including business owners and members of Parliament. This raised awareness for the plight of the poor among the rich, who never had a reason to go into the poor districts of the city. However, laissez-faire remained the prevalent attitude, and it would be another 25 years before real action was taken to improve the conditions of the poor. Chadwick's report did have some limitations. The most significant of these was that Chadwick believed that cholera was spread through the foul air using the theory of miasma, when in fact cholera is a waterborne disease. Chadwick was able to set up a central board of health in London to monitor the outbreak of cholera. However, as the chairman of this board, he disagreed with John Snow when he presented proof that cholera existed in contaminated water pumps. John Snow conducted an investigation into a single area of London, called Soho, which was one of the poorest areas of the capital. In 1854, 700 people died of cholera in a matter of weeks in the Soho region of London alone. Snow conducted an investigation whereby he plotted out the cholera cases on a street map. He was then able to pick up important patterns. He observed that the greatest number of fatalities were on Broad Street, especially those that were located near the water pump. He then investigated the brewery, which was an anomaly, since none of the brewery workers had caught cholera, despite being close to the other victims. He discovered that the workers did not use the Broad Street pump, because they had access to the brewery's beer. Since this was fermented, it was much safer to drink than contaminated water. There was a second anomaly. A rich lady from a neighboring district had also died of cholera. However, on further investigation, Snow discovered that this woman had her servant travel to Broad Street to collect water from this particular pump. Her reasoning: she liked the taste. In the short term, Snow was able to save lives by removing the handle to the Broad Street pump. This stopped the epidemic in Soho, and so further reinforced Snow's findings. He also found that the water pump had a broken pipe, so sewage from the adjacent cesspit was leaking into the water. It was the human waste that was contaminating the water, and this contained the cholera bacteria. John Snow's investigation did have limitations, because he was working in the 1850s, so was a decade off being able to use germ theory to explain how the cholera bacteria had contaminated the water. Robert Koch was able to bolster Snow's reputation. When he investigated a cholera outbreak in India, he discovered the bacteria strain and traced its origins to the river Ganges, proving it was waterborne. However, the belief in miasma was very strongly entrenched in both society and the medical community, making it hard to change practices. In the long term, Snow's findings were accepted, and this placed responsibility on local authorities to provide safe drinking water and a proper sewage system. This coincided with the construction of London's first sewage system, which we will study in the next section. Snow's findings also opened up investigations into other waterborne diseases, such as typhoid. Unfortunately, both cholera and typhoid remain a problem in low-income countries across the world today due to poor access to safe drinking water. However, by knowing the cause of these two deadly diseases, humanitarian workers and charities can look to educate local communities about the risk of consuming untreated water. Let's now examine the government regulations that were put into place during the 19th century in order to tackle poor public health. Unfortunately, for the first half of the century, laissez-faire remained the prominent attitude, and this resulted in the continued decline in public health conditions, especially in the poor districts of cities. During this time, no laws were passed to improve public health. The first Public Health Act came after Edwin Chadwick's report about the health of the poor. It made several recommendations that local authorities could act upon to improve public health. However, none of these measures were compulsory, and so very difficult to enforce. For example, local councils could use taxpayers' money to clean the streets and improve sanitation, but only if 10% of taxpayers agreed. Since only the wealthy paid taxes, this measure had little impact on their lives, and so it was difficult to get even 10% to agree to the measure. Furthermore, the Central Board of Health was created, but it was abolished only 10 years later. There was a measure to introduce local boards of health with a qualified medical officer, but by 1872, only 50 towns had set these up. This shows how slow the uptake was by the richest members of society in recognizing their social responsibility for the public health of the nation. However, there was a significant improvement in 1875 with the Second Public Health Act. As part of this act, all local councils had to have a medical officer who oversaw the public health of their town. Landlords were made responsible for keeping their properties in good order, and slum housing could be demolished if improvements were not made. Most importantly, though, the Act placed the responsibility of public health onto the local council. It meant they had to improve conditions by providing a proper sewage and drainage system, rubbish collection, street lighting, and a safe water supply. This shift was very important, as it signaled the end to the laissez-faire attitude of both the central and local government. One key reason why the laissez-faire attitude changed was the Summer of the Great Stink in 1858. This was a particularly hot summer, and as a result the river levels dropped and the sewage from the Thames overflowed onto the embankment outside the Houses of Parliament. This meant that MPs had to attend work with the putrid stench of the Thames in their nostrils. They tried to cover the stench by soaking the curtains of the House of Commons with a chloride of lime solution. They also contemplated relocating to Hampton Court in the countryside so to escape it. However, eventually, they came up with a better and more long-term solution. They would invest money into building a robust sewage system. The government hired an engineer called Joseph Bazalgette to design the London sewer system. As a result, it was very well designed. Bazalgette used precise mathematical equations to calculate the angle of the sewers so that the human waste would continually move at a steady pace. He also designed the sewer so that it was larger than needed, since he estimated that London would continue to grow in population. As a result, some parts are still in use today. It was completed in 1866, and after this cholera never returned to London. Given this proven success, the government then invested in sewage systems for all the major industrial cities across Britain. In 1884, the right to vote was extended to more working-class men, and the constituencies were reconfigured so that city dwellers had fair representation, whereas before this the constituencies largely benefited those living in rural areas. This gave the government a clear incentive to take urban issues like public health serious, since their position of power now relied on the votes of city dwellers. It would not be until 1918, following World War I, that all men were given the vote, but this was a step in the right direction. In our next lecture, we will be studying the Liberal government and how they took on board the concerns of the working class in establishing Britain's welfare state. Let's now return to our overarching question of why did public health decline during the industrial age? Firstly, the main reason for the decline in public health was the rapid urbanization that took place during the industrial age, which resulted in overcrowding and unsanitary conditions. Secondly, there was some attempt in the mid-19th century to overcome the issue of disease amongst the poorest citizens of London through the investigation and report of Edwin Chadwick. However, because Chadwick clung to the incorrect theory of miasma, his investigation made a limited impact. There was a breakthrough in 1854 when John Snow conducted an investigation into the cholera outbreak in London's district of Soho, and was able to prove that the disease was spreading through contaminated water. However, it took another 25 years before Robert Koch was able to prove that bacteria could spread in both the water and the air. Finally, the government was very slow to discard the laissez-faire attitude and put regulations in to provide better public health for the poorest in society. By the end of the 19th century, there were finally laws put in place that meant local councils were responsible for providing safe water and waste disposal in their towns, and measures were also starting to be put in place to demolish slum housing. Thank you for watching. Tune in to the next lecture to learn about the liberal reforms and the establishment of the welfare state at the start of the 20th century.